Isabella could feel her heart pounding as Victoria's voice echoed through the grand ballroom. "Who do you think you are?" Victoria sneered, eyes narrowing with disdain. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Isabella. The weight of the secret she had guarded for so long pressed heavily on her chest. This was the moment she had dreaded, the one that could unravel everything. And yet, what happened next would change their lives forever.
Hello. Welcome to True Tales Authentic Emotions. I'm Emma Blake, excited to bring you another wonderful story. Enjoy.
The grand ballroom was filled with the soft murmur of conversations and the clinking of crystal glasses when suddenly, Victoria's sharp voice cut through the air, halting everything. Her words dripped with venom as she glared at Isabella, who stood quietly at the center of the room, feeling her heart race. Every eye in the room was now on her, waiting to see her reaction. Isabella could feel the weight of their stares, but she remained calm on the outside, even though the turmoil inside her was nearly unbearable. "Who do you think you are?" Victoria's voice was cold and calculated, her piercing blue eyes narrowing as she spat the words. The question was laced with disdain, intended to belittle and humiliate. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze, and the tension was palpable. Isabella could feel the familiar sting of embarrassment, but it wasn't just Victoria's words that hurt. It was the knowledge of the secret she had been carrying for so long, the one that could unravel her entire world. The room fell into an almost eerie silence as every guest turned their attention to Isabella. The once bustling ballroom now felt suffocating, with the weight of so many eyes pressing down on her. Isabella stood there, her mind racing as she fought to keep her composure. She knew that this was the moment she had always feared, the one where her carefully guarded secret was at risk of being exposed. The pressure of the secret she had been hiding for so long felt like a heavy burden pressing down on her chest. Isabella had always known that this day might come, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it. She could feel the weight of her own fear and the expectations of those around her, making it harder to breathe. Yet, despite the turmoil inside, she knew she had to stand her ground, no matter how much it hurt. This was the moment Isabella had dreaded for so long. The moment where everything she had worked to protect could be shattered in an instant. She had always known that her secret had the power to destroy everything she cared about. And now, faced with Victoria's cold stare, she realized just how close she was to losing it all. But as she looked back at Victoria, something within her shifted. She wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. What happened next would change their lives forever. The tension in the room was unbearable, and the air was thick with anticipation. Everyone expected Isabella to crumble under the pressure, but they were about to witness something they never could have imagined. The events that followed would not only alter Isabella's life, but would also have a profound impact on everyone in the room, especially Victoria. Isabella grew up in a modest neighborhood, far removed from the wealth and opulence she would later experience. Her home was small but filled with warmth, the walls adorned with simple but cherished memories. As a child, she was taught the value of hard work and humility, lessons that would shape her deeply. Even as her father's business empire grew, Isabella remained grounded, choosing to live simply and avoid the trappings of wealth that could have easily been hers. Despite the luxurious life she could have led, Isabella chose to work as a waitress in a local diner, far from the glitz and glamour of her father's world. She wore modest clothes and kept her true identity hidden from those around her. She found fulfillment in the small acts of kindness she could offer, connecting with people on a personal level rather than through wealth. This was her way of staying true to the values she had been raised with, even if it meant living a life far removed from her birthright. The news of her father's passing came one quiet evening as Isabella was finishing her shift. A simple phone call delivered the devastating message that her father, a magnate who had built an empire from the ground up, was gone. The weight of his loss hit her harder than she could have imagined, not because of the wealth he left behind, but because of the deep bond they shared. She knew that the world would soon discover who she really was, but she was determined to keep her identity a secret for as long as possible. Isabella sat in her small apartment that night, holding the letter her father had written to her just days before his death. In it, he expressed his pride in the choices she had made, living a life of simplicity and integrity. He urged her to continue following her heart, regardless of the pressures she might face after his passing. Isabella's resolve to keep her true identity hidden grew even stronger as she read his words, knowing that this was the path she was meant to follow, no matter how difficult it might become. Isabella believed that by staying silent, she could endure Victoria's relentless cruelty. She thought that by being patient and maintaining her composure, the hostility would eventually fade away. Her upbringing had taught her the value of humility and restraint, and she clung to these principles, hoping that they would see her through this storm. But deep down, the hurt was growing, gnawing at her with each cutting remark. Isabella's resolve was strong, but even the strongest walls can crack under constant pressure. Victoria, on the other hand, saw Isabella's silence as a sign of weakness. To her, silence was submission, and she intended to use it to her advantage. Every encounter became an opportunity to assert her dominance, her words growing sharper and more venomous. Victoria's disdain for Isabella wasn't just personal. It was fueled by a need to prove her superiority, to remind Isabella of her place. But what Victoria didn't realize was that every word, every sneer, was only pushing Isabella closer to a breaking point. Despite the mounting tension, Isabella continued to hold her tongue. She smiled politely, nodding when necessary, and kept her head down. But behind those soft brown eyes, a storm was brewing. She could feel the weight of her secret pressing down on her, knowing that it could change everything if it ever came to light. The more Victoria pushed, the more Isabella felt the need to protect herself, to protect the life she had carefully built. Yet, she still hoped that patience would prevail, that somehow, this would all pass. The rude comments didn't stop, they only intensified. Victoria's taunts became a daily routine, a cruel game that only she enjoyed. And while Isabella tried to brush it off, each insult cut deeper than the last. The hurt was becoming too much to bear, and the cracks in Isabella's calm facade were starting to show. She knew she couldn't keep this up forever, that something would have to give. But for now, all she could do was endure, hoping that her patience would be enough to outlast Victoria's cruelty. Victoria's malice grew with each passing day. She no longer limited herself to sharp words in private. Now, she made sure everyone around could hear her biting remarks. Isabella would be setting a table, and Victoria would loudly comment on her appearance or insinuate incompetence, making Isabella's work environment increasingly hostile. Each time, Isabella felt her resolve weaken, but she held her tongue, believing that her patience would eventually pay off. But the repeated humiliation started to chip away at her, making her feel smaller with each passing day. The other employees, once friendly with Isabella, began to distance themselves. They feared that being seen as her ally would make them the next target of Victoria's ire. They avoided eye contact, spoke to her only when necessary, and left her to deal with the most difficult tasks alone. The isolation was crushing. Isabella, who had once found solace in her work, now felt completely alone. Her once bright eyes began to dull as the pressure mounted, and she started questioning how much more she could take. Victoria had reached her breaking point. Her disdain for Isabella had grown into something more dangerous, a determination to see her gone. She cornered the restaurant manager one afternoon, her tone sharp and insistent. "She needs to go," Victoria demanded, her piercing blue eyes locked onto the manager. The tension was thick, and though the manager respected Victoria's influence, he hesitated. He knew Isabella's work was impeccable, her dedication undeniable. But the pressure was mounting, and he was caught between a rock and a hard place. Isabella could feel the shift in the atmosphere as she walked into the manager's office later that day. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. The manager, a kind man who had always appreciated her work, looked uncomfortable. He informed her of the complaints against her, his voice filled with reluctance. But he also gave her a glimmer of hope, a final chance to prove herself. Isabella's heart sank, but she nodded, determined to persevere. She knew this might be her last opportunity to keep the job that had become her lifeline. Victoria's subtle manipulation began to take its toll. She started planting seeds of doubt about Isabella's competence, whispering to the other staff and even dropping comments to customers. Little by little, She created situations where Isabella would appear negligent or incapable, all while maintaining an air of innocence. Victoria knew how to play the game well, and it wasn't long before the manager began to notice. Isabella, who had always taken pride in her work, now found herself under scrutiny. The once solid ground beneath her feet was starting to crumble. The pressure became unbearable as Isabella realized that her job was on the line. The fear of losing her livelihood was overwhelming. This job wasn't just about earning a living. It was about preserving her dignity and independence. She could feel the eyes of the staff on her, the whispers behind her back. Isabella knew she was being pushed into a corner, but the worst part was the feeling of helplessness. She was losing control over something that had once been her sanctuary, and the thought of losing it all was terrifying. The true extent of Victoria's power was revealed one evening when she was seen leaving the restaurant in the company of Charles Grant, one of the most influential investors behind the establishment. Whispers spread quickly among the staff, and it wasn't long before the full story came out. Victoria wasn't just a regular patron with an attitude. She was the wife of one of the restaurant's key financial backers. This revelation sent shockwaves through the staff, and Isabella realized that she was up against not just Victoria's arrogance, but her formidable social power as well. Isabella's heart sank as the reality of the situation hit her. Fighting against Victoria's cruelty was one thing, but now she was up against a woman with the power to make or break her career. The weight of this realization was crushing. How could she possibly stand a chance when her opponent wielded such influence? The stakes had just been raised, and Isabella found herself more vulnerable than ever, struggling to find a way to hold on to her job, her dignity, and her sense of self-worth. Isabella sat alone in her small apartment, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. She had chosen this life of simplicity, walking away from the wealth and power that could have shielded her from people like Victoria. But now, as she faced the cruel reality of Victoria's influence, doubt began to creep in. Had she made a mistake? Would revealing her true identity solve her problems, or would it only make things worse? The thought of stepping back into the world she had left behind filled her with both fear and a strange sense of longing. As the days passed, Isabella's internal struggle intensified. She questioned whether her humility and patience were virtues or just signs of weakness that others could exploit. Each interaction with Victoria made her wonder if staying silent was the right choice. Was she only making things harder for herself by not standing up and revealing who she truly was? The conflict gnawed at her, leaving her feeling more isolated and unsure than ever before. As Isabella continued to navigate the hostile environment created by Victoria, a subtle change began to occur. Charles, Victoria's husband, had been observing Isabella from afar. Unlike his wife, Charles was not impressed by arrogance or wealth. Instead, he admired qualities like dignity, kindness, and resilience, all of which Isabella displayed even in the face of adversity. One afternoon, when the opportunity presented itself, Charles approached Isabella with a gentle smile, offering a few quiet words of encouragement. His presence was unexpected, and his sincerity caught Isabella off guard, leaving her both reassured and puzzled. Over time, these brief interactions with Charles became more frequent. During one of these encounters, Charles mentioned something that made Isabella's heart skip a beat. He casually referred to a detail from her past, something only someone with access to certain circles would know. Charles seemed to have a deeper understanding of who Isabella was, though he remained discreet. This revelation added another layer of tension, as Isabella realized she was not as invisible as she had believed. The knowledge that Charles might know more than he let on left her both wary and curious about his true intentions. Isabella had been enduring the increasing pressure and hostility at the restaurant for weeks. But now, a new opportunity presented itself. A gala event that most of the staff had been invited to attend. It wasn't the kind of place Isabella usually found herself, but this event offered a potential reprieve from the daily tension and a chance to see things from a different perspective. She knew Victoria would be there, along with others from the elite circles she had distanced herself from. Accepting the invitation, Isabella decided to step into the world she had left behind, not for herself, but to explore whether this environment might provide a solution to the challenges she was facing. As the day of the event approached, Isabella found herself standing in front of the mirror, her thoughts racing. This was more than just a social event. It was a confrontation of her past and present. She was preparing not only to attend but to face Victoria on equal footing, in a setting where she couldn't hide behind her humble persona. The uncertainty of what lay ahead was palpable, yet there was a quiet determination in her eyes as she made up her mind to attend. This was a new strategy, a new battlefield, and Isabella was ready to face whatever came her way. As Isabella stepped into the grand ballroom, her heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The opulent surroundings, with glittering chandeliers and elegantly dressed guests, felt like a world apart from the everyday struggles she had been enduring. However, her relief was short-lived. As she glanced around the room, her eyes locked onto Victoria, who stood near the center of the gathering, exuding confidence and authority. The sight of her nemesis in this setting sent a wave of dread through Isabella, intensifying her already high-strung nerves. She realized that the evening might be far more challenging than she had anticipated. Victoria's eyes caught sight of Isabella almost instantly. A smirk played on her lips as she watched Isabella try to blend into the crowd. The wheels in Victoria's mind began to turn, already plotting how to use this public setting to her advantage, to once again humiliate Isabella in front of others. This was Victoria's domain, and she wasn't about to let Isabella forget it. The tension in the air was palpable as both women prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Each step Isabella took bringing her closer to what could be a defining moment in their ongoing battle. The moment Isabella steps forward to greet a guest, Victoria seizes the opportunity to strike. In a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, she makes cutting remarks about Isabella's presence, questioning why someone of her status would dare attend such a prestigious event. The words are like daggers, designed to wound and humiliate, and they hit their mark. Isabella feels the sting of the public scrutiny, the eyes of the guests turning towards her, some filled with curiosity, others with judgment. The air is thick with tension as Isabella struggles to maintain her composure, but the cracks are beginning to show. As Victoria's words hang in the air, Isabella's resolve begins to falter. Her normally calm and gentle demeanor is replaced by a look of utter vulnerability. She feels exposed, her confidence shattered in front of a crowd that seems to revel in her discomfort. The humiliation is almost unbearable, and for a moment, Isabella considers fleeing. But her feet remain rooted to the spot, her mind racing for a response that refuses to come. The hostile atmosphere is suffocating, and the silence from those around her only amplifies her pain. Isabella, feeling the weight of the public humiliation, quietly slips away from the event, seeking refuge in a secluded corner of the venue. Her heart pounds with a mix of shame and despair, her mind swirling with thoughts of defeat. She feels completely alone, as if the walls are closing in around her, amplifying her sense of isolation. As she sits, she contemplates the life she has chosen, one of simplicity and humility, and begins to doubt whether it has truly served her well. The idea of reclaiming her rightful place in society, of leveraging her true heritage to protect herself, becomes a tempting escape from the relentless scorn she faces. The solitude deepens Isabella's inner turmoil, her once steady resolve now wavering. She wonders if staying true to her modest lifestyle has only made her more vulnerable, more exposed to the cruelty of those like Victoria. The thought of stepping into the role she was born into, of wielding the power and influence she has long kept hidden, starts to take hold. Yet, even as she considers this path, a part of her clings to the values that have defined her journey so far. The tension between these two worlds pulls at her, leaving her torn and uncertain about the path she should choose. As Isabella sits alone, still grappling with the weight of her earlier humiliation, she is unexpectedly approached by a man who seems vaguely familiar. He is an old family friend, someone from a past life she had tried to leave behind. His presence stirs memories she had long buried. With a gentle yet firm tone, he begins to reveal something that shakes her even further. Her father had left behind specific instructions for her. He tells her that her father always knew this day would come, a moment when her humility and patience would be tested to the extreme. The instructions were clear. She was to maintain her humility and conceal her true identity until a particular time, one that was fast approaching. This revelation deepens Isabella's internal conflict, but it also ignites a spark of hope. Perhaps there was a greater purpose to her father's plan, something that could guide her through the storm she now faces. The weight of the secret her father entrusted to her feels overwhelming. On one hand, it adds to the burden she's already carrying, but on the other, it provides a glimmer of clarity in the chaos. Isabella's mind races as she tries to understand the full implications of what she's just learned. Her father's wisdom and foresight were things she had always respected, but now, they seem like the only solid ground in the shifting sands of her current life. As she reflects on this newfound knowledge, the possibility of a solution begins to take shape in her mind, a way to honor her father's wishes while also finding a path to protect herself. Isabella, with renewed determination, decides that she will not leave the event defeated. The revelation about her father's wishes fuels her resolve to stay and face whatever challenges lie ahead. Her father had believed in her ability to maintain her dignity in the most trying circumstances, and she would not let him down. Isabella takes a deep breath, straightens her posture, and walks back into the main event space, her eyes scanning the room for potential allies. She is no longer just a guest. She is someone who has decided to reclaim her power, no matter how overwhelming the odds may seem. As she navigates through the room, Isabella notices a few familiar faces from her past, people she had once trusted and who had always supported her family. These individuals approach her with subtle nods and warm smiles, offering her a sense of solidarity in an otherwise hostile environment. Their presence gives Isabella the strength to continue, knowing she is not entirely alone in her battle. With each new connection, her confidence grows, and the fear that had gripped her heart begins to loosen its hold. Perhaps, with the right support, she can turn the tide in her favor. The evening took a dark turn for Isabella when Victoria, with her sharp wit and calculated demeanor, began to twist the narrative in front of those who mattered most. Using carefully chosen words, she made it seem as though Charles had been deceiving everyone, including Isabella, all along. The charm that Isabella once saw in Charles was now tainted by doubt. The tension in the air was palpable as Victoria's manipulations started to take effect, making Isabella question her judgment and the sincerity of the few allies she thought she had. Her heart sank as she realized that the one person she had begun to trust might not be who he seemed. Isabella's confidence crumbled as she watched Charles struggle to defend himself against the accusations that Victoria was so artfully crafting. The warmth in his deep green eyes now seemed distant, as if the connection they had was slipping away, lost in the confusion and mistrust that Victoria had sown. Isabella felt more alone than ever, her resolve shaking as she questioned who she could truly rely on in this deceptive world. The isolation she felt was overwhelming, and the night that started with a glimmer of hope now threatened to engulf her in despair. Isabella, feeling the weight of the evening's events, found a moment of solace in a quiet corner. Her thoughts drifted back to the teachings of her father, who always emphasized the importance of humility and inner strength, no matter the circumstances. The chaos and betrayal that swirled around her now seemed like a test of those very values. As she stood there, reflecting on her choices and the path she had taken, Isabella realized that her father's lessons were more relevant than ever. She understood that while the world around her might be filled with deception and challenges, the core of who she was must remain untarnished. With a renewed sense of purpose, Isabella resolved not to let the evening's trials break her spirit. She knew that whatever happened, she needed to maintain her integrity, not just for herself, but to honor her father's memory. The decision brought a calm determination that settled over her, replacing the doubt and fear that had gripped her earlier. She would not be swayed by the pressures of the night or the manipulations of those around her. Instead, she would stand firm in her values, ready to face whatever came next with a clear conscience and unwavering resolve. Isabella's mind began to piece together the subtle clues she had overlooked throughout the evening. As she reflected on her interactions, a sense of clarity started to emerge. Moments that had once seemed inconsequential now held deeper meaning. She realized that some of the guests at the event had subtly supported her, even if it wasn't immediately apparent. A brief conversation here, a knowing glance there. These interactions hinted at a network of allies she hadn't known she had. Isabella's heart swelled with a cautious hope as she began to see that she was not as alone as she had feared. As Isabella's newfound awareness grew, So did the realization that the truth about her identity was starting to surface. Details that had once been hidden or ambiguous were now revealing themselves with striking clarity. She could feel the threads of her true heritage being pulled into the light, setting the stage for a revelation that would change everything. The weight of the evening's events suddenly seemed less daunting, as if a path was being illuminated before her, leading to the resolution she so desperately needed. As the realization of Isabella's true identity dawned on Victoria, a wicked plan began to form in her mind. With a cold and calculating demeanor, Victoria decided to use this newfound knowledge to destroy Isabella once and for all. She plotted to expose Isabella in front of everyone, ensuring that the humiliation would be public and irreversible. Isabella, unaware of the looming threat, continued to navigate the event, but an unsettling feeling of dread began to creep into her thoughts. The tension escalated as she felt the walls closing in, realizing that her carefully guarded secret was on the brink of being exposed. The evening grew darker, both literally and metaphorically, as Isabella braced herself for what seemed like an inevitable downfall. The energy in the room became suffocating as she sensed the change in Victoria's demeanor. The fear of public disgrace loomed over her, casting a shadow on everything she had fought to maintain. Isabella knew that once Victoria's plan was set in motion, there would be no turning back. She was standing on the precipice of complete and utter devastation, with her reputation and future hanging by a thread. As the moment of truth approached, Isabella stood before the crowd, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. She knew that Victoria was about to unveil her secret in a bid to destroy her completely. But instead of waiting for the blow, Isabella took control of the situation. With a calm yet powerful voice, she began to speak, revealing her true identity. But rather than boasting of her heritage, she spoke of the values her father instilled in her: humility, respect, and the strength to remain true to oneself, regardless of circumstances. The room fell silent as everyone listened, captivated by the sincerity and dignity in her words. As Isabella continued, she directed her gaze towards Victoria, who stood frozen, her plan unraveling before her eyes. Isabella explained how her father had wanted her to understand the true meaning of wealth, not the material kind, but the wealth of character and integrity. In that moment, it became clear to everyone, including Victoria, that Isabella's true power lay not in her hidden wealth, but in her unwavering principles. The venom in Victoria's eyes began to fade as the realization of her own pettiness washed over her. The atmosphere shifted dramatically as Isabella's calm presence disarmed the hostility in the room, leaving Victoria with no ammunition to use against her. By the time Isabella finished speaking, the impact of her words had reached every corner of the room. The respect and admiration that filled the air were palpable, even from those who had once doubted her. Isabella had not only defended herself, but had also turned the situation into a powerful lesson for everyone present. As she looked around, she saw the genuine smiles and nods of approval, a stark contrast to the animosity that had greeted her earlier. Even Victoria, who had been her fiercest adversary, was visibly moved. Her expression softened as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. Isabella had won, not by force, but by embodying the very values she cherished most. In the aftermath of the revelation, Isabella felt a serene calm wash over her. The weight of her concealed identity had been lifted, and she was finally free to live her truth. As she stepped forward into her new reality, Isabella remained committed to the values her father had instilled in her. Despite the changes around her, she continued to live with the same humility and integrity that had defined her life before. Her journey had been tumultuous, but it had only strengthened her resolve to stay true to herself, no matter what challenges came her way. Meanwhile, Victoria, once so determined to ruin Isabella, found herself grappling with the consequences of her actions. The humiliation she had intended for Isabella had instead fallen upon her. But rather than wallowing in bitterness, Victoria began to reflect on her own life, realizing that her pursuit of power and status had led her down a destructive path. It was time for her to start anew, to seek redemption by adopting a different perspective on life, one that valued respect and humility over domination and control. As weeks turned into months, the lives of both women took on new trajectories. Isabella, now openly embracing her true identity, became a beacon of grace and strength in her community. She used her newfound position not for personal gain, but to uplift others, embodying the principles she had always cherished. Victoria, on the other hand, embarked on her own journey of redemption, slowly but surely mending the bridges she had burned and learning the true meaning of empathy and humility. In the end, the resolution brought closure not only to the conflict, but also to the personal struggles of everyone involved. Isabella's life continued, shaped by the lessons she had learned and the values she held dear. Victoria's journey was just beginning, a path towards self-discovery and transformation. Though their stories were different, both women found a sense of peace in the end, understanding that life's challenges are opportunities for growth, and that the true legacy one leaves behind is the impact they have on the lives of others.